Welcome to another episode of Living with FASD, Candid Conversations with Patti Kasper. This podcast is for those who are living with the effects of prenatal exposure to alcohol, their loved ones, and anyone else wanting to learn more about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Each week, you'll hear from someone whose expertise is either professional or living experience with FASD. I'm your host, Patti Kasper, bringing you both. Now let's get started with another candid conversation. Welcome to episode 74 with Living with FASD, Candid Conversations with Patti Kasper. Today I am joined by, I wanted to have a panel discussion just to really get a lot of different viewpoints on identity and what does it mean to receive an FASD diagnosis. How does that impact one's sense of self? So very warm welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Patti, for inviting us.
You know, I'll just start off with this. I have only recently been diagnosed, in fact, only 6 months ago. I self-identified as having been impacted by FASD probably 5 years ago or so. So it's relatively recent. But I have wrestled with the issue of disability for much longer than that, thanks to having type 1 diabetes, which has long been, for decades, been classified as a disability. But I had never seen myself as disabled because I didn't remember life without it. It's all that I knew. I only began resonating with that label of disability when I realized I didn't have enough skills to keep my blood sugar out of the dangerously low section, and began to realize how much I needed further assistance from outside of myself in order to stay alive. And that's when it really kind of clicked for me. This is a disability. This does hinder me. This does keep me from doing all the things that I want to do. And then, you know, and that's what led to my wanting to get a diabetic alert dog. And once I was partnered with her, that's when I ran head straight into the concept of invisible disability. So it really was interesting coming to terms with that whole concept and being challenged by that. And then when I began this journey with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and realizing how widespread that is.
Okay, well, I can definitely tell you about my experience with someone who was just different, kind of weird, but not so out there that they took steps to do anything to me. So I was just a weird person. All my life growing up, I've been told I was weird, and weird is bad, bad is wrong, wrong is sinful, and I was bad and wrong. Not what I was doing or what I did, but I as a person was 100% bad. So when I got my diagnosis, the first thing that the diagnostician sat me down, looked me straight in the eye and said, look at me. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. And I had owned all that badness, that weirdness. I'd taken it on and accepted it. I was a bad guy. Suddenly, my diagnosis put into light the fact that I'm not. I'm different, but it doesn't make it bad. So my own experience was it was actually freeing. I did not feel that I was then constrained by the term disability. Did I feel disabled? No, I have no idea what that feels like. Conversely, people have asked me, would you, given the choice, want to be a neurotypical or not affected by fetal alcohol? And you know, I like myself. I like who I am. I like what I bring to the conversation. And I can't see myself being anyone else. So, no.
I love that. I remember when I finally went to my supervisor at work and I told her what I had figured out, what I began to suspect, and what my mother had confirmed. And she said, well, that makes sense. And I'm like, what? And she's like, well, you just sometimes say and do odd things. And I just chalked it off as, oh, well, that's Patti. But since you brought this out, it makes sense. And I too felt it to be very, not really freeing per se, but there was just a peace and a grace that washed over me because I was able to, when in looking back at all the situations in my childhood and those transitional years, oh, I cringe at some of my decision making. When I look back at those times, it makes so much more sense. And when you're in the moment and living life, you will come up with reasons, but it's only in hindsight, following that diagnosis and learning what FASD is and is not, that you're able to look at all that with the lens of FASD and realize, yeah, none of what I thought it was made sense. This makes sense. And it was a gift.
Well, one of the things about getting a diagnosis is you learn your strengths and your weaknesses, where you might need help. I mean, I would struggle with certain things that now I know that I'm not equipped to do. So I find other ways, other people who can help me, like apps and things like that, to take that pressure off. So
Work around.
again, it's been very, very positive for me in that way. Now, some people may use it as a crutch. That can happen. A lot of that depends on dismaturity, how old they are, how cognitively aware they are, and these things. And each person is so different that you can't make a blanket statement. Now, for me, largely positive. For somebody else, maybe not so much.
What have you found valuable with the clients that you've worked with when it comes to how they view themselves?
Well, my experience as a person with a condition of my own, it's not FASD, but I have two identifiable, I live with a genetic disorder that's invisible, but is considered, here in France where I live, it's permanent disability. It's not recognized in the United States. Doctors don't, they think it's a psychiatric problem or things like that. They mistake it all the time. And having lost my hearing, being part of the deaf community now, are busy and they may pass and they may say something to you and you don't respond and they begin to get upset. And so a lot of people that I know who are in the deaf community have the experience of having to kind of go, oh, hi, sorry. Or not sorry, just, oh, hi, deaf. Were you talking to me? You know, like, didn't know, sorry.
No.
Or
we can't see whether your ears work.
Oops, you know, I have these, but not like yours. They don't function anymore. So these kinds of little nuances that are big in terms of one's life, one adapts to, well, this is how my body is, so it's always been this way. This is my typical. This is my normal. So it's different for other people. It's weird for other people. But I think the thing that I pluck out when I watch what you're saying and I watch what you're saying, RJ, and what I saw in the kids and the adults that I knew in the years was we all want to make sense to ourselves, you know? And if in the process of getting a diagnosis, we find out, okay, well, this is something I have. It's not all of who I am, but I have this. And what can we do with it? How, you know, because sometimes it really swells up and it gets in my way. And other times it's just, you know, I'm here, I'm the way I am, and it works, you know. So it's that duality that I saw. And what the other thing that I noticed over time, and I was talking to a young woman who made a film with me at one point in the research program that we were doing, which was qualitative research, not quantitative. And qualitative is carried by people's experience, by their stories, by their lived reality, pulling out the themes of their lived reality and what the solutions are from their point of view, which to me was a great gift because it's a different way of conducting science, but it honors one's subjective knowledge. And what I like to say, lived wisdom. What I learned from this one young woman who related very much to the porcupine imagery of that young child, the younger child, and how the porcupine theme became a metaphor that families and kids and even adults sometimes related to when they have, they'd have sensory reactions or they'd have dysregulation that just kind of grabbed them by the back of the head and went, these moments. She said, that metaphor helped a lot because it helped explain to my family what was hard and what would get stuck. And then I do these other things to overcome. She's a runner, like Rebecca Tulu, amazing runner. And so running was also one of her strategies. I mean, people find beautiful strategies, beautiful workarounds. But she was saying, if I could film again, I would have a lot of different things to share about, how I think of myself now. And she was then a mother with several children when I last talked to her. And really, really, what beautiful, wonderful person. And she's the one who really touched my heart, as well as family members, with the notion that it's a moving target. Identity shifts with us as we change in our life experiences and in our developmental process. And we all have a developmental process. And so identity starts in a certain place and then it moves with us. It's not a fixed thing. And that's what's so hard about descriptions in literature and descriptions made on the basis of statistical findings, is that one kind of gets these hardened categories as if they're fixed and as if they don't flex and move over time. And my experience is that they do enormously. Some people that I've known wanted to identify and affiliate with others based on the shared body culture of, this is true for me too. Is it true for you? Oh, wow. And all this time I thought I was just gonna screw up all the time, instead of an oops, hairball. Okay, let's move on. Yeah.
Speaking of porcupines, your book is coming out hopefully this week.
It's very exciting. Thanks.
And RJ, you're one of the differences between my sit by sit version 1 versus version 2 is your story. The conversation you and I had together is in version 2 and it is out this week. So
I can't wait. In official.
Yeah.
If I can throw an aside to Antonia's book, which I've actually been thrilled to have that.
Thank you for taking
the story of the porcupine is reflected in my hair. This is why my hair is like this. These are my warnings. These are my spikes. In a confrontational way, I can be a pussycat. But that duality of personality is always there. And a lot of that comes from my own personal experience. There was a lot of trauma growing up and things like that. I have become, at certain points in my life, very defensive. And that was not good for me either. So now I'm opening up. I'm quite happy to share my own experience in the hopes that maybe it'll inspire others to look at their experience and see what they can do with that.
Yeah.
which it's a huge gift.
Yeah.
When people can compare notes with one another around what it's like to live with a certain body culture and a certain difference, there's comfort in it, there's variation in it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but it is a gift, and people give this to each other. We
hold mirrors up to one another.
Oh, that's beautifully said. Yeah. Yeah. But the opening up, RJ, was that for you? Was that easier after the diagnosis?
Oh, absolutely. Up until the diagnosis, I was extremely closed. I didn't share anything with anyone. I was very hard to get close to because in my life, I learned if someone says, I love you, what they're really saying is, I'm going to hurt you. That was my experience. I grew up with that and I carried that. And once I got the diagnosis, it started to make sense. And I was able to leave them with their judgment and live my own life, which is I want to be open. I want to help and I want to share with people in the hopes that they can take that and run with it and go forth. Red Shoes Rock is a perfect example of that. The idea was just, I'm different. I know it. When I look down, I can see that helps me. And that message that Jody then carried forth has resonated around the world. And it's all about being the individual that you are and reveling in it. It's not always easy. It is not easy, but for me, it is so worth it because I can't be someone that I'm not.
Right. And I think too, able to do that, whether it's an issue with memory and not remembering all the steps, or not being able to sequence things right, or having sporadic mastery, being able to do something one day and not the other, like you with your physical condition, Antonia. Some days the body works and other days it doesn't.
True.
We're hearing all these messages throughout our childhood about we're not trying hard enough, we're not wanting to be bothered, we're selfish, we're stupid, we're this, that, or the other. And we start to believe that. And we start to call ourselves all those names. And the diagnosis does change that. Exactly to your point, RJ, when the therapist said, it's not your fault. Because you often do not see neurological damage.
Well,
It doesn't show the way physical disabilities do. Neurological disabilities are underneath it all.
It's pretty hard to see a problem or certain differences in our neurology with the same organ that's experiencing it.
Yes.
If the brain has to say, I have a stomach ache, I think it's my stomach. That's a little different task than having to look in assessing one's wiring and saying, am I having glitches? Am I glitching out here? Because there's a term that I heard from a neurologist that really mind blind. We have areas of mind blindness like that. And to have to have that experience, it's involuntary. Mm-hmm. So it just clicks on and clicks off randomly. And so it's like a little circuit that sometimes connects and then sometimes doesn't. And the experience of living with that little thing that happens is unique for each person, where it gets in their way or where they can slide on, or they can use a workaround or an app or something with it. They find their workarounds. People are amazingly resilient. That's what I have learned, is that humans are remarkably resilient when they feel a sense of connection again. It's relationship.
Bingo. When you have a connection with someone and you're able to say to someone, do I do that? such a difference because they can see what I can't see. And if I'm able to trust in their judgment, they can help me see what is invisible to me. That makes perfect sense. Yes.
If we can trust them, if we can trust them not to judge, that's the word.
And minimize, yeah.
Judging.
Yeah.
If there's trust, then it's possible to let them say, well, that is that thing there that, yeah, that's different. Without harshness, without cruelty, without dismissal, or shaming.
Yeah. So those connections are vitally important. Absolutely. And they go both ways. They don't just go one way. I think I can help other people and they can help me. So it's reciprocal.
That is absolutely true in my experience. What about you, Patti?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's actually another element of the struggle, because so often, especially when we're younger, I think a lot of the more social and adaptive functions tend to catch up somewhat as we age. RJ and I are both old enough that we have caught up quite a bit with our age mates, right?
And surpassed many.
As kids, thank you. As kids and teens and young adults, knowing who is trustworthy is a huge challenge. And one that I have royally screwed up from time to time in my young adult years. But that's part of it. If you open up to the wrong person, then those differences can become a formidable weapon.
Yes. And especially like in interpersonal relationships and things like that. The things that you say in confidence can come back later to be used as a weapon against you. That, unfortunately, that's human nature, and we have to struggle through that. It's the difficulty and the beauty in finding the person who is that person that you can open up to and isn't going to like use it as a cudgel against you down the road.
Yeah.
But when, again, younger people are given a description of society and the way it's supposed to be, and they're told that, you have to look like this and be like this. And that's got to be confusing. When I grew up, my only aim was to be a hippie kind of thing, because that's what was going on. Peace and love and all of that. And I, as a kid, that was perfect for me. I've lived with that all my life. I guess I'm just an old hippie.
RJ, you've brought up so many good points. What do you make of the challenges that people maybe early upon diagnosis, or maybe it's for if they are still at home when they're diagnosed, parents pursued it and got it. There's a tension between access to services which rely on inabilities and needing to always remember the good stuff and focus on the good stuff so we don't see ourselves as less than. Where do you see that tension playing out? Because there is that fine line, I think.
Well, one of the things that I have consistently spoken about from the beginning is the need for a person first perspective. As I like to say, FASD is about people. Mm-hmm. It's about the people who have the disability. So getting that connections, and you don't need a Harvard professor, but you might need your mom or your aunt or your cousin, because they can make that difference. You don't have to have 1,000 diplomas on the wall to be the person who makes I like to say you need to listen and with more than your ears and see with more than your eyes sometimes with FASD. A lot of times you think it's A, B, C, and meltdown. We don't see that A, B, C have little subcategories and little roads that often go off. And it could be something as simple as a bad sleep the night before, Maybe you didn't eat breakfast or something, and this all balls up and then comes out at once. And then it's incumbent on me, especially when I'm dealing with other people on the spectrum who are in that situation, to figure out why they're doing that. Because anger is often a way to hide sadness and fear.
And fatigue.
And once we realize that that anger is not directed at me,
Mhm.
I didn't do it, I didn't cause it. Okay, we're good. I'm not going to take it personally. Let's find out what brought you here today. Connections are so vitally important. And it's got to be about the person first, not the disability. And once we get to that point, in Canada, luckily, organizations such as Can FASD have wholeheartedly embraced this. And it's not just changing the paradigm, it's knocking it on its butt and kicking it right out the door. Yeah. We're changing the world one person at a time. So, yeah, we need to understand that this isn't a top-down, this is the way I see it thing. This is reciprocal. We can see it from inside, you can see it from on top, and together we're going to raise the entire group and the conversation.
Rising
in that
tide
way.
raises all boats. Yeah. CanFAS does such marvelous work.
Excellent.
They do. I think, at least down here in the States, what I see my work, it's very person affirming, that same approach. However, systems have the opposite approach, right? Systems are very medical model.
They're top down.
They're very top down, and very pigeonholy, and I think that creates a lot of the tension. And I think that's probably one of the biggest things wrong with the system we have down here.
Well, that's where FASD key workers, as they have it in some province, and caseworkers in other provinces can make that huge difference. And we need more of those to interpret the system for the people who don't live in that world and be a bridge between the two. We need those people vitally.
Yeah.
That is so wise.
One of the reviewers for my book said, Key Warner said in her comments that it's stories that change people. We've known the facts about FASD for decades. Well, some of them. We've known facts and figures and statistics. That's not what people relate to. People relate to stories. They are moved by stories and changed by stories, and you get that through relationship. No, it's storytelling that creates that empathy.
And that's exactly what I do. I go out and I tell stories to people about living with FASD, and those conversations open up to incredible places. I have met the most incredible people on the spectrum, their parents and their brothers and sisters, and we have great conversations because we're all able to do that because it's safe.
And that's what heals.
Mm-hmm.
That's what heals.
Yeah.
And that's also what humans do have a tipping point for personal activism. And the thing that's so difficult about trying to talk numbers to people and say, well, the problem is this big and it's this many. And when we get to the point of the big numbers, many people have an internal experience that they never put words to. They never tell anybody, but they feel overwhelmed by the size of the problem. And then it's actually, they have kind of a learned helplessness reaction to it. They kind of feel disempowered to make it, well, what could I do? To make any difference to that? That's enormous. Stories they not just heal, but they mobilize. They motivate people because people feel like they can connect. And if they can connect here, maybe they can connect here and here and here. And it can grow in an organic kind of way. Mm-hmm. where they're more willing to be, as you said, to be open and to recognize those moments. Oh, this is one of those moments. Maybe if we share about me, they are having that experience. I connect to that.
That's a very interesting point. And with that same point, you can go both macro and micro.
Yeah.
You know, I share that, you know, it was kids that brought me to this, but then learning that the diagnostic rate is so pitifully low, realizing that based on the most recent census that we have, there's nearly 15 million adults wandering around the states with no idea that their struggles have this neurological basis from the alcohol exposure. And that's an enormous number that systems can relate to. But if I'm having a conversation just on an individual level, or the people in an audience, they don't relate to that for that exact same reason. What they relate to is 1 in 20. That means there's at least one, probably a handful of people living on my street or my kid's classroom, or
It makes it
you
immediate.
know, or on the golf course, you know, I just whatever. And then being able to take the knowledge of what they've learned and approach people differently and make that difference.
I think people relate a lot in those bigger numbers that we blank out, but it's the personal experience that can make such a big difference. Even, you know, things like discussing stigma and judgment and things like that is often better accomplished on an individual one-to-one basis where we can talk to each other than like some large grand statement being put out by an organization with a whole lot of figures and facts. People tend to gloss that over very, very quickly.
Yeah.
I have a really funny story I can try and tell here about stigma and its effects on people personally. And it's in the book, but I'll tell it short, the short version. I was doing a training at the local med school in Portland where I lived for a long time. And I was talking to nurses who were in community health centers, but they were also in their education at the medical school. So they were in placements, and the director of the nursing department wanted to have this training, so we did. And during the course of the training, I happened to have two really close friends, one who was a public health nurse and the other one who was a physician, who was a doctor. And so I had a little bit of back information about doc culture and nurse culture, because they're different. In a medical system, you have a lot of different specialties, and their little tiny microcultures are different from one another. But I had some of this back information because of my friends. There was this wonderful nurse we were talking about stigma and how to begin to talk to a mom who, a young woman who was pregnant and had also admitted to using alcohol or other drugs. And so the nurses were suddenly kind of, you know, they were reacting like they were stuck, and it was going to be tense and it was awkward. And one nurse spoke up and she said, you know, I mean, I really understand how important this is, but you know, you're a therapist, and I'm not a counselor. I'm not trained to talk to a woman about something so personal as her alcohol use. And I said, I can tell that what you're concerned about is wanting to have a productive conversation and not wanting to have it go badly in talking to your client, to the woman. But can I offer that I have friends who work in your field, and one of them was talking about how routinely she talks to her clients about STDs and all the sexual health and reproductive health issues that come up. And she's quite comfortable with that. And I kind of wondered, there's nothing more personal than a woman's vagina. And suddenly this nurse burst out laughing And what she realized what she was stuck on was the taboo. It was the stigma, not the actual interaction with the woman. It was that whole backstory of how do we begin to talk about something that is a sacred cow that nobody wants to point at the downside of that. That's, alcohol is a cherished economic income, and has all these wonderful things associated with it, and many levels of society are really attached to that. And so there is this huge taboo about saying anything. We can have statistics about people dying in drunk driving accidents. We can have all of the list of side effects of this toxin, just like for pesticides or other things. But somehow this one has a special status, and we don't like to touch that. And it was her reaction that really the whole room, we all kind of laughed together, a sigh of relief that we could finally kind of say it. You can say vagina, you can say booze, it's just like, oh my goodness, and it really brought the conversation to a new level about what is that invisible wall? What is that stigma really? What is that? Because it's a big, hard glass sealed chamber. No one's supposed to poke that bear.
Perfect example. At one point, a number of adults and I got together and we approached a lawyer about a class action suit. And we were told that would be in the courts for 100 years easily. No lawyer will even touch it. So
there were a group of lawyers down in Texas who were pursuing a class action suit. I don't know what came of it later, but there are many groups who drink a lot in their after hours, after stressful days. And the medical field does a lot of that. Attorneys and judges are powerfully invested in their booze, believe me. Know about that one, family history. And yeah, it's there in a million forms in the culture. And so then, we can't talk about this condition without the A word in there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
then we have to try to steer the conversation to responsible use, not anti-alcohol, but how do we use alcohol in our lives? How do we even think about it? People come home, we sometimes have to fight with that one too. And these are monsters that we don't need to fight, but they keep being brought back up because even something as simple as saying responsible use tends to get people's hackles up a little bit because they're very defensive about their own personal alcohol use.
I think too, the bit about FASD being 100% preventable adds to the stigma. It adds to the stigma because it's not true.
I agree. I'm with you 100%.
Because by the time women know that or even suspect that they're pregnant, there can be untold kinds of damage done.
Mm-hmm.
And women cannot
more often than less often.
And women cannot be judged for using a legal substance before she knew she was pregnant.
Not going there because, like you said, it's not really pertinent to our conversation.
Yeah.
That, to me, what that is that's control after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a natural kind of grief reaction to saying, oh my gosh, we wish this harm hadn't happened to somebody. Oh dear. Oh wait, it could have been prevented. And it's part of a grief reaction. It's actually an emotional statement. It's not a statement of fact.
No.
But it isn't often because it's being said by a research community. It's not seen as an emotional statement. It's seen as a factual statement. And it isn't. It isn't.
It's actually wrong.
It's inaccurate, but it's an emotional truth. But there we are. The relationship, we have to have a relationship, and we have to have an understanding that these things are occurring in real lives. And real life is a lot messier than our theories about how it works. So technically, we have to differentiate between emotional statements and facts. I mean, they really thought that all the things they were saying in the research, in the first wave of research, that all of those things were facts because they were statistically valid findings. And yet, for example, if a family is raising a child and the child is having struggles, but doing pretty well, kind of getting through, they wouldn't necessarily go back to a researcher and say, we're having struggles. What are you looking into about people with struggles like this? They wouldn't seek it out. So already you have a bias in who the catchment population is and who you're studying, because there's a whole band of people who haven't been represented who then grow up and self-identify and are saying, you know, that fits for me, but we didn't have any kind of resources to go to for it or anyone to talk to about it, or we didn't even know that this was a thing. You know, so it's kind of hard to look at all of that and say, okay, here are all the facts about FASD. It's not all the facts. And part of the reason that I am so grateful for the voices of people with lived experience being able to bring all of this forward now is that this is the big story, not those old statistics. These stories, sip by sip, all of you, this is the reality that others of us have seen and been interacting with over the past 30, 40 years.
You know, when I was working on the first edition of the book, because I was pushing myself so hard for the publication date, I'm sure I'm not the only one who does this, but when I am fixated on a goal, I am merciless toward myself, towards getting it done. And so I would turn into, you know, there was someone else that said, I look at the diagnosis as getting the right prescription for your glasses, getting the right lens. You know, when things were just all in a blur before, that's what I'm hoping the book, the podcast, any speaking engagements that any of us can be involved in. That's what my hope is that we reach somebody and say, take a look at your life through this lens. Does it make a difference? Is it the right lens for you?
And much like Antonia was talking about, that information that she was discussing, the old top-down view, that's what I saw after my diagnosis when I decided to figure out what FASD was all about. And it didn't take long before I started going, no, this is not my experience. And this is not my experience. Am I that different? And the more I found out that top-down view was interpreting what they saw through their own biases. It wasn't necessarily the reality of the people who actually live with it. So to me, it became very important to speak my own experience and hope that people would recognize maybe some small part of their experience in that.
You're liking that, huh, Antonia?
I love that. Yeah. That's why everybody needs to hear from you and to read your book, Patti. And it's because it makes such a big difference. It makes such a big difference.
Yeah. RJ, I'm still thinking we should get that bus going sometime.
Would you? That would be so cool. That would be so cool. Say again what that is, because that is
So
that's beautiful.
the last time RJ was on the podcast, well, go ahead and tell the story, RJ.
Set up a tent or something, invite people in and discuss FASD in realistic terms. And we could drop people off, pick new people up if they wanted. we could make this into like a year-long tour of all of North America if we wanted to. And, it could be a joyous, happy sort of thing because not everything about FASD is negative. In fact, people with FASD are some of the funniest and happiest people I know when they're in their own element and not being forced into something that they're not comfortable with.
Yeah.
These are incredible people. I love working with other people on the spectrum, and quite often I do. I've mentored some people. If you know Maggie May, last year we were able to go out and do some events together when she was in North America. And younger people have as much to say as I do, so I'm very happy to be bringing them up to share their experience as well.
Yeah, I saw a post
Yeah.
on Maggie May's feed yesterday. She's packing to come back for this year's conference.
Yep.
Yeah.
She's on her way.
Yeah. With the cat in the suitcase. Obviously, that cat's afraid she's going to stay away as long as she had last year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But it's so incredible to see people feeling safe enough to speak. For a long time, there were only a few of us who were out there, Miles Himmelreich, myself, and a few others. But it was hard to find people who were willing to start sharing. And now, if you look at Flying with Broken Wings, my Facebook group, we have 8,000 people and probably the largest number of people on the spectrum. And it's a safe place. They
Wow.
say what they want to say there, and we don't police everything in such a wicked way. And I hope that helps people in the future carry that forward, to not minimize ourselves because of the stigma or because of what somebody else may think. That's I got my red shoes on. You know what? To heck with you. I'm going to do this my way.
Well, I'm so thankful that you guys could join me today. And I think
Thank you.
this was a conversation that I think was very needed out there as a resource, and hopefully others will think about the things that the three of us shared and ponder it, have their own conversations with people about it, maybe bring it up on Flying with Broken Wings. Let's see if we can keep the conversation going in a thread or two. But I think it's a conversation well worth having between people living with it, between them and their family members, their coworkers, just to expand that understanding, get those ripples moving out further and further.
And sometimes we have to educate our own doctors, even.
Sometimes.
Not just sometimes.
Quite often.
Quite often.
Oh,
And, it can start just with taking some literature to your doctor and say, you need to recognize that this is a thing. And I've had a lot of really good relationships with doctors. Initially, at first, they can be a little bit like, you're just a layman, But eventually, if you talk to them person to person, you can get them to understand that they don't know everything about everything either. So
what they do, who are healers, not just doctors, but healers. They stay open and they really, really listen. When someone comes and says, this is what's going on in my body culture. This is how it works here.
And I think that was
They're not defensive towards it, which is always such an enormous relief after having to go up against the barriers of ignorance, but distance because of that.
Having lived with type 1 diabetes my entire life, I have only had one doctor who got it.
Yep.
Who did not judge. And it was because she herself also had type 1 diabetes.
There you go.
Yeah, made all the difference in the world. And that was the hardest part about leaving my previous home and coming to North Dakota, was knowing I'd have to find a whole new team of peeps to work with.
That's not easy to do.
No.
And it's one human at a time.
Yeah.
Individual conversations for long time.
Yep. Oh, well, thank you again, both of you, for your time
Thank
and
you,
your
Archie.
thoughtfulness and all your beautiful words. We'll see everybody out in who's watching or listening next week for another episode, another candid conversation about living with FASD. But thank you both. RJ, thank you again for being in Sip by Sip second edition.
It's
And
always great fun.
yeah, Antonia, thank you so much for everything you did to move Sip by Sip along. And
My
I'm
pleasure.
so excited that Parenting Your Porcupine is coming out. Yep. All right. Thank you both. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Living with FASD Candid Conversations with Patti Kasper. Feel free to send comments, questions, and topics you'd like to learn more about, hear more about, to me at livingwithfasdpodcast@gmail.com. Please remember to like, follow, and share this podcast on whatever platform you use so that more people can find the podcast. Have a blessed week, everyone, and tune in next Monday for another candid conversation on Living with FASD.